We are now 1 month away from the political intellectual event of the year. Unregistered Weekend in Chicago, featuring Curtis Yarvin, Ben Burgess, Batya Ungar Sargon, and me. 3 days of free speech, free thought, and saying what you're not supposed to say. We now have 2 tiers of tickets so everyone can afford to come. Go to unregisteredacademy.com to get your tickets now. I hope to see you there. This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. There are now more homeless people in American cities than ever before. But my guest this week has a solution. However, if he's right, I will have to rethink some of my most closely held beliefs. This is my interview with Leighton Woodhouse. I am joined from Oakland, California, not far from me, by Leighton Woodhouse. And Leighton, I got to say, you've caused quite a bit of trouble lately, in my mind. You've caused a lot of trouble for me because we have very similar backgrounds, and we both now live in the Bay Area and have for a while, and we're observing what's going on here, but you have very different takes on what should be done and what should not be done in ways that are really brilliant and really challenge me and challenge some of my most prized beliefs, in fact, around drugs, around crime, things like that. So I've been thinking really hard lately because of you, because of my interactions with your work on this. So you write for Substack, you've done some podcasting. I think you should do a lot more, and I think you will do a lot more. I think you're going to get a lot more attention in the media, and I hope this is part of that. So because it's just you're talking to an audience mostly, I think, that is going to be skeptical of what you're saying, like me. But let's talk first about where we live and where we grew up. So I was born and raised in Berkeley, and you were too. 10 years apart. I graduated from Berkeley High in 1983. You graduated from Berkeley High in 1993.
Right.
And we both come from the left. We both were involved in the labor movement, both worked in the labor movement, both have academic careers. You have a master's, I have a PhD. And now we are looking at this world we grew up in that's very much transformed before us and makes us very sad and very unhappy and very angry. So let's talk about what it actually looks like here. And I think a lot of people sort of hear about San Francisco and the homelessness and the drugs, and partly from your reporting on it, but most people don't ever go to South of Market or the Tenderloin and don't actually see it firsthand. They don't drive by the 880 here in Oakland and see the homeless encampments.
Yeah.
Let's talk about it. Describe it. How many homeless people are there now? I saw numbers recently. I don't know if you have the same numbers, but I'd like to hear what your data is. What's just quantitatively and then also qualitatively, what is it like? What is life like now, in general for everyone here, but also on the streets?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the 880 because you might be talking about the Wood Street encampment, which is the one like by the train tracks near the
Yes.
they mud. So I've spent some time there, and I didn't even know it existed before it was mentioned, before I heard about it. But
Yep.
like driving by it, it's covered by so many highways that
Hmm.
unless you're like really looking for it, you don't see it. And it's pretty far removed from anywhere you would go. It's in sort of like a, I don't know, industrial warehousey kind of
My
area.
my boxing gym happens to be right on the other side of that, so
Ah,
I have to drive all along that thing to get to
oof.
the boxing gym. Yeah, so many times a week I'm there. Yeah.
Right. So, well, it's mostly gone now because they've been clearing it out since they had that fire.
Oh
So a
yeah.
few weeks ago there was a big fire, and the city kind of used it partially because it like as a legitimate excuse, but nevertheless kind of an excuse to clear it out.
Mm.
But it gives you some idea of the blight because people are very familiar with what's happening in the Tenderloin and South of Market. It's right in the middle of downtown. It's highly visible. That tent encampment is like Mad Max. Like I'd never seen anything like it before, and I've been in tennis encampments up and down California, and it's like you walk into an area which is fenced off because it's part of the rail yards. It is a complete. It's a square. It's a full square mile, basically of junked cars. And then out of these cars, people have dug out of these cars like little kind of shelters. Some people live in trailers. There's a lot of like dumped trailers there that people are living out of. So not so many tents there as it is trailers. And it looks like the most Mad Max dystopian thing I'd ever seen in my life. And one guy we interviewed there, um, you saying that they called it. Said that they called it something like Pleasure Land or something like that because, and we were like, why do they call it that? And he's like, you can do whatever you want to here. Like he's like, you smoke meth all day, play music out of club size speakers, blasting full blast, just go shoot shit, like just shoot stuff with guns and like target practice. Like it was like basically it was like being a child in like an
Where is
amusement.
this? Where is this?
This is on Wood Street. So Wood Street is it's like it's where there's it's in West Oakland,
Oh,
by underneath, so it's near Emeryville, right near like the Best
okay.
Buy and stuff near Mandela Parkway. You would never You'd have to be going there. Like you can be just a few blocks away at the Best Buy and you would never pass by it. Like you have to go
So
out of your way and know where you're
I,
going because there's nothing there but it.
I'm talking about yet another homeless encampment,
Okay.
which is under the aerial, just along the 880. It's about a mile long,
Mhm.
a little further east, but hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people with tents all up and down. So I mean,
Yeah.
it's proliferating. Is kind of what the point we're making is, right?
Yes.
And what are the numbers you know? I mean, the word is that there's been a significant increase in the number of homeless here and elsewhere since the beginning of the pandemic. Is that right?
Yes. So I don't know that anybody has really good numbers for it. I mean, I think in San Francisco, it's something like 8,000 homeless, unsheltered homeless people. There's more homeless people,
Right.
but unsheltered homeless people. And 8,000 is a lot for a city of 800,000
Yeah.
or so. San Francisco, I don't know what it is now, but it's less than a million.
Mhm.
And 8,000, of course, highly visible people by definition because they're living
Right.
on the sidewalks and streets and in parks.
In
Uh,
downtown, in the middle of the city, in downtown.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And then there's many more who are either living in shelters or SROs, and et cetera. So, the total population in San Francisco, I think it's kind of unclear, but I would put it around probably 8 to 10,000, probably for unsheltered. I don't know what it would be if you had it in sheltered.
Hmm.
Um, Oakland, I have no idea. I haven't really dove into that, but I imagine, it's obviously Oakland's a smaller city, but I
The
wouldn't, I
number
would,
the number I saw was 5,000,
okay. So
which
that's an even higher proportion
yeah,
than in San Francisco. It's less visible in Oakland,
right,
because it's not right downtown.
right.
But it's quite visible because you
Yep.
drive by it on the highway every day, on the freeway every
Hmm.
day.
Hmm.
But yeah, so it's every bit as, I mean, it's crazy. It's like I described it, I think in one article I wrote, is like this is somewhat of a tortured metaphor, but I think it makes sense that it's like the existence that you have as sort of a normal person, non-homeless person in the Bay Area, is
Hmm.
that you're living a life in which it's like there's two movies being projected onto the same screen at the same, two projectors projecting two different movies onto the same screen. It's like you just, because you're there, it's right next to you. You're seeing that, you're seeing them, they're seeing you, but everybody just, but it's two totally separate existences,
Hmm.
which often collide. But it's sort of like, it's weird. It's like you're like almost pretending, like, not to belabor the point, but it just occurred to me that this one time I was in Barcelona. This was like many, many years ago, but I was just as a tourist. And I remember seeing, like, Barcelona's got a crazy nightlife, right? Kids,
Hmm.
like, people are up all night. I remember going to this internet cafe, and there were all these kids, because they had those back then. All these kids were waiting in line to use the internet computers, and they were all like super drugged out with pink hair and stuff, and they'd been out all night, and it was like 8 in the morning. And then they were in line alongside all these people who clearly just woken up an hour before, and in suits and like with briefcases going to
Yep.
work, and
Hmm.
like in the same line for the same cafe, getting coffee for two wildly different reasons. And that's kind of what it feels like just to live in the Bay Area.
It is so wild in exactly that way. So South of Market, for people who don't know, it is inhabited almost exclusively by two groups: very wealthy tech people and homeless people. There's
And
there's
fewer and
there's
fewer
no
of them.
there's no almost no middle class people in South of
Right,
Market.
right,
And the Twitter headquarters is right in the middle of it, for
right.
instance. I mean, lots and lots of tech companies have headquarters in South of Market. So you see like these young men with their t-shirts and their fancy sneakers, the tech worker uniform, walking among schizophrenics and drug addicts who are completely out of control. And yeah, the juxtaposition,
There's a
the
flagship, Whole Foods opened a flagship store on 8th
right.
and Market, right across the street from the Tenderloin Linkage Center. And it was like their flag. It's a 60,000 square foot store. It was like one of their big national stores. They were like, this is a big, important Whole Foods that they'd opened up there, because they'd started the plans pre-COVID. And so the plan was, it's in the Trinity Towers, which is like a big tower, luxury condos for tech workers. And the Trinity Towers wanted to be able to say, there's a Whole Foods in the basement, like it's underground. You can just take the elevator down into the Whole Foods to the prospective tenants and buyers. And now it's like, are you in? It's like insane. It's like there's a Whole Foods there, like, and you go into the Whole Foods, and there's just like, people just flagrantly boosting off, like just stealing shit off the shelves flagrantly. Now they have cops in there stationed. Am I allowed to swear on the podcast?
Absolutely, you're
Okay.
encouraged.
Okay. Yeah, it's like the Tenderloins just spilled into it. And now there's few, it used to be that there was like all these, tech workers on hoverboards, right beside beside, like, homeless people, like smoking meth on the sidewalk. But now there's actually fewer and fewer of the tech workers, and more it's just the Tenderloin. And
Right.
and Silicon Valley is barely discernible there anymore in that neighborhood.
Right. Right, because they've been leaving since the pandemic, though.
Right. A lot of that is because work from home has changed everything.
What's the number I just saw? 50% of tech companies, or the company, or just companies in general in San Francisco, are staying at work at home, staying with work at home.
That sounds about right. I know that from a SF Standard article that was saying that so there's a big moment coming up soon, because there are all these leases that were signed before the lockdown that are now
Hmm.
coming up for renewal. So there's all these buildings that are still under contract, but when they come up for renewal, obviously these employers aren't going to renew those contracts anymore, because they're sticking with work from home. So in the Standard article, they cited a report that was estimating that in mid-market would have like 43% vacancy in their commercial real estate. And there was another neighborhood I wasn't familiar with, Jackson Square, I think it was called, which is a neighborhood I
Yeah.
never heard of.
Hmm.
Anyway, 50% is what they were projecting for there. So think about these are these big towering office buildings. A lot of them are brand new, and
Hmm.
and they will have 50% vacancy.
Right.
So it's just a ghost town.
Right. What about Salesforce? Salesforce has a huge headquarters right downtown, right in the middle of all this. I don't know if, I mean, how many people work in there? Must be tons of people working there.
Good question. All I know is that Benioff is now like taken off to Mexico or something. I don't know.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, he's like not, he's like gone for the next few years or something, like not coming to the office anymore, barely participating. I just heard this the other day, so I'm not an expert on this, so don't quote me on it. I suppose I
Uh,
am being quoted on it because I'm saying it on a podcast, but this might be misinformation, but that's what I heard.
yeah. So, for me growing up in the 70s and 80s here, and for you growing up in the 80s and 90s here, I mean, it was Market Street, south of Market, that whole Tenderloin was always rough, very rough. And there were always some homeless people and some schizophrenics and quite a few drug addicts and drug dealers, right?
Yeah.
But it is just exponential, the growth of all that stuff there.
I mean,
And
Jack London wrote about South of Market.
yeah, right, sure. It's always been grimy.
Yeah.
Always been grimy, but never like this. It is an assault on all of the senses when you are there.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can't, this is central San Francisco. This is basically downtown San Francisco. You can't go there at all without seeing dozens of completely out of control, schizophrenic, and probably drug addicted people.
Right.
And many of them are violent, and or at least quite hostile and threatening. I've had to defend. I once, not long ago, like last year, I had to defend an entire cafe full of people from this guy who was trying to break in to the cafe, and he was throwing chairs around. I mean, he was completely out of his mind. It wasn't that difficult to stop him, but yeah, I had to like hold the door shut to stop him from coming in the cafe.
Yeah.
This is just a normal place, middle of the day and a Monday afternoon, and there was a bunch of like nice ladies who worked at some tech company in something cafe, and there's this completely out of control guy. He's walking up and down the street, throwing chairs, threatening people, yelling at them, screaming at them. That's normal.
Yeah.
That's normal.
Yeah. Well, what I find most egregious is like that stuff is normal and that is very disturbing. But what I find much more offensive and much more just insane is that it's normal to have like hundreds of drug dealers openly selling meth and fentanyl on the street 24 hours a day.
Right.
Like that is beyond my comprehension still. Like
Okay.
that we have a city in which you are just openly allowed to do that. You can just stand on a street corner. It is a very low risk business. The worst that's going to happen to you is you'll lose your stash. Maybe a cop will arrest you and take your stash. Maybe you'll spend a night in jail. Maybe. But then you're out there the next day back at your corner. And so it's a very low risk business, and it's ubiquitous. And literally, I mean, people who don't live in the Bay Area, I feel like people might not believe me when I say this, but you'll have like a platoon of cops like standing, just stationed up, posted up on UN Plaza, and like 30 feet away from them, there's like 20 dealers with like each of whom have like 5 addicts around them that they're just openly selling to, and that's a normal day in United Nations Plaza in San Francisco.
Yep. Yeah. The cops are doing much less these days around here. So in our town now, where we now live, Oakland, people are now finding out about sideshows, because that's become, have you noticed, it's become a national phenomenon? There's now sideshows.
I have. There was in fact, one took place in just north of Washington Square Park in Manhattan, like NYU. There was a sideshow.
Yep. People doing drag racing and doing donuts in major intersections in cities. The people in Oakland invented that. We're so proud of it. We're perversely proud of it. Unfortunately, I hate them.
It's not a good thing.
It's very bad. And speaking of cops doing very little, there was a sideshow right here, 2 blocks from where I am right now, about 6 months ago. And I ran down there to check it out. And there were 2 cars doing big, huge donuts in the middle of this major intersection, which is actually an entrance to the freeway. Major intersection, Park and MacArthur, huge intersection in Oakland.
Yeah.
And I walk up, and there is a cop in a cop car right there watching.
I thought you were going to do like 2 years. It'll be a cop is like in the sideshow.
That's will be
just riding the whip.
Totally. That's exactly right.
Yeah. Well, the crazy stuff in Oakland is like have you heard some of the murders that have taken place in Oakland over the last couple of years are like something out of like a dystopian fantasy novel. Like the party bus. Did you hear about the party bus that was on the 580? There's in the middle of the night, there was a party bus. It was like a rented party bus. There were a bunch of like teenagers to young 20-something kids on this bus coming back from the city, driving down the 580 right by Seminary. And this is right by my house. My exit is High Street. So it's driving down the 580, and there was a guy on the bus who some other people wanted to kill. And so these guys are chasing it in a car, and they roll down the window, and they just on the freeway driving alongside the bus start shooting into the bus. And then the bus driver freaks out, of course, pulls off on Seminary, which is right by Mills College, and drives down off the off ramp. And then the car chases off the off ramp, shooting at it. And then finally, I think the bus crashed, and like there were like like a 16-year-old and a 22-year-old girl were shot to death on the bus. That was like one incident. That was like a year and a half, 2 years ago. There's another incident with like this guy in the middle at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, a dad, this high school basketball coach, like with a couple of kids, had some beef with some guy. This guy was the dad was totally like no criminal record, not mixed up in anything, just like literally, I think he was a basketball coach in Antioch or Pittsburgh or something. And he's at a park not too far from me where there's football practice. There's like 50 kids doing football practice. I think he was with his kid. His kids were on the team, so he was there with his kids on the team. And dude in motorcycle who like had some squabble with him for some reason just comes up and just shoots him and executes him in the head, just in front of 50 kids in the middle of the day at a park where they're playing football. This is like, and that didn't make national news. You know, the crime that made national news, and maybe not even national news, was the most horrific, but like this is what it takes to for people to even hear about it, was that 2-year-old kid
I was
in
going
the
to say,
car seat on the
yeah,
freeway, Jasper something, Chinese
yeah,
kid,
yeah,
toddler, asleep in
yes,
his car seat, and gets
okay,
shot to death from another car driving by trying to shoot a different car while driving on the freeway. Like
yep,
this is like Mad Max shit.
yeah, yeah. That was the ultimate. The toddler getting shot to death driving down the freeway. I mean,
And then a couple months later, there was another woman. There was a woman who was sitting at the Bay Bridge Toll Plaza, going to San Francisco. Ironically, her mother had been very shook up about the story about that kid, and that her like this is an adult woman, but her elderly mother had been very shaken up about that story. And then that woman's daughter is in the Bay Bridge Toll Plaza, just waiting with her kids in the back, just waiting for the toll, gets shot in the head
what?
from like another car through like crossfire.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Wow. I'm just reeling from that. I didn't even know about the party bus thing. I didn't know about most of these.
So
Yeah,
this
I
shit is
hear.
happening, and the left is like defund the police.
Yeah,
I'm like, sorry, I come from the left, but I'm not drunk off my ideology to that extent. Like I'm still here on planet Earth, where I actually care about like basic law and order. You
yeah,
know, not
yeah.
having people openly dealing drugs on the street in the Tenderloin, not having people openly smoking meth in your kid's playground, and not having just innocent people being executed in a park. You know, there was
Yeah,
an sorry, I'll just name one. I'll just layer one
yeah.
more story onto
Do
it.
it.
Yemeni family,
Yes, yes,
you know about the story, flees
yes.
Yemen flees the war, flees the violence in Yemen. One of them starts the family started a liquor store, and they lived near Bishop O'Dowd, but the liquor store was on 90th or something. And there's an Arab guy and a black kid, and they get in some beef in the store, and the black kid, I think the Arab kid pulls a gun or something, and the black kid shoots him. Or maybe no, I'm sorry. It was the other way around. The Arab kid shoots the black kid. The Arab kid had nothing, didn't know the store owners, but because he was Arab, the kid who got killed, his friends assumed that the store owner had something to do with it. So they started a campaign of retaliation against that family. The family owned another liquor store across town. They burned that store to the ground. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
they attacked, I believe they attacked the 90th Street liquor store, but they didn't kill the guy. So what they did is they found out where he lived, and they burned his house down. And then that guy, a refugee from Yemen, he evacuated his elderly mother, saved her life, and then in the process of trying to get his 2-year-old daughter out of the house, isn't able to, and he and his 2-year-old daughter burn alive in this arson, after fleeing from the war in Yemen. And that's in Oakland. That's like not far from us.
So things are going great.
Yeah, yeah. Same.
The number of murders in our city have gone up dramatically, right?
Yeah.
And the police chief here keeps reporting on this and keeps saying we need to do something about this, but of course the city council and the mayor do next to nothing. In
Right.
fact, the city council was debating, was it just last year? They were debating whether to defund the police, and the mayor actually opposed them on that. And so they did not defund the police, I think.
They voted to cut $10 million from the mayor's proposed budget. And, of course, one would say ironically, but it's actually predictable that the two districts, my district and the district to the east of me, are the two districts that have the highest crime rates
Right.
and are the least white in Oakland. And those are two council members were the two council members that voted against cutting the mayor's budget.
Boom.
So, the defund push is not coming from the high crime, higher proportion Black and Latino neighborhoods. It's not coming from there. It's coming from other districts. And then the mayor was opposed to obviously cutting her own budget, and then the crime soared, and they ended up restoring the $10 million that was cut from her budget. And I wrote about this, and of course I was attacked from people on the left who were like, they didn't defund the police. The mayor was increasing the budget, and they cut the mayor's increase to the budget, which is exactly what I reported it as. So I'm aware of that. But the point is, the police, I think, were already grossly understaffed. I think they had to cut like 2 police academies already. So the money that the mayor was restoring was money just to bring. Oakland is one of the most under-policed cities in the country. Like in terms of per capita and given the crime rate, it has the police force is meager compared to other comparable cities of its size and like hazard level. So the mayor's budget was entirely appropriate.
Yeah. Well, okay. So you're talking to a guy who for many years has been calling for ultimately, not immediately, but ultimately replacing the police with some form of community policing. I would like to eventually, ultimately defund and replace the police. Um, I don't like the state, and I don't like the state having guns, and I don't like the state having a monopoly on violence. But there is no alternative right now. There is no community policing apparatus. There's no security that's been developed in private hands or by communities to replace the police. And so when you defund the police or stop them from being police, we get what we've gotten. We've gotten a massive increase in crime.
Since you've brought up the phrase monopoly on violence, we can get into some nerdy stuff,
Yeah.
because that's Weber's phrase, except that technically Weber's phrase is a monopoly on the legitimate use of
Legitimate.
violence.
Yeah.
Because the government does not have a monopoly on violence because other people have the means to use violence, but they do have a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, meaning that other
Right.
people using violence is considered illegitimate. Now, I think that the government absolutely should have a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, but not because I think that the government should be violent, but because I understand that it's not a choice between the government having violence or society being nonviolent. It's a choice between the government having that monopoly or having warlordism, right? It's like if the government doesn't have the monopoly on violence, then you have vying factions that are contending for a piece of that legitimacy. You have, in effect, Afghanistan pre-Taliban, or El Salvador pre the latest regime kind of putting in place these authoritarian mechanisms.
Or Somalia.
Yeah, yeah. Or, Oakland. I'm just kidding.
Yeah. Yeah.
but
At least
but
East Oakland.
yeah. But it's like the problem that we're facing is, I mean, this whole argument about defunding the police, which I realize is a bit outdated because this is kind of like from 2020 and people aren't really talking about it anymore. But it's like, look, man, the police are obviously very, very far from perfect. I mean, the police is not one unitary thing. It's just a whole tier of our society. But police departments are ridden with many problems. But there are at least formal mechanisms of accountability over the police, which there are not over some just self-appointed vanguardist warlord. So like if you defund, you get rid of the police in a neighborhood. This is just common sense. if you get rid of the police in the neighborhood, then there's going to be somebody who's going to fill that vacuum,
Yeah.
right? That's exactly what happens in under police neighborhoods like South LA, where like the reason why you have gangs is in part because they are under policed. They are both over policed and under policed at the same time.
Mm.
Um, but you have a power vacuum, and it's filled by other forces which are far less accountable than even an unaccountable police department. So
What do you mean that they're over policed and under policed simultaneously?
well, the clearance rate for like murder in South LA is abysmal,
Right.
right? It's like there's times when it's like well under 50%, like
Yeah.
25%, 50% is probably a good year. And so like if you kill somebody, and so they're overpoliced for obvious reasons, right? Like they're overpoliced in terms of especially what we saw in the 1990s with like ramparts and stuff like that. But they're underpoliced in the sense that if you kill somebody in South LA or in many cities in America, you more or less can rationally expect to get away with it. You are probably not going to get caught. So what that leaves the community with is a choice. Like if your relative, if your brother gets killed in randomly, then if you live in South LA, you can expect that there's not going to be like justice brought through the criminal justice system. So you either live with impunity for the murder of your brother, or
Right.
you have to take it upon yourself to retaliate. Those are your choices.
Right.
So it's quite understandable why people take it into their own hands, and it's also understandable that fuels a cycle of endless violence.
Mm.
So that's what I mean by underpoliced. If the police were actually investigating and closing these cases, if there was swift and short and certain justice,
Mm-hmm.
people would not, the murder rate would go down.
Mm-hmm. No, I think
People
you're right
wouldn't.
about all that. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think you're right about all that. I mean, I have this very utopian, idealistic, never been seen before on planet Earth thing in my head about, South LA like organizing itself, or Compton organizing itself, organizing a security force, replacing the state. But I mean, it's never
Well,
really even
that
been,
stuff gets
I mean,
corrupted too, because like
what's that?
that stuff gets corrupted too, because
Sure.
like urban alchemy in San Francisco. So there's like, for folks who are not from here, there's a nonprofit group called Urban Alchemy. They are based in San Francisco, but now they operate in LA and other cities. But they patrol the Tenderloin, and it's an alternative to the police, quote unquote,
Yeah. Okay.
which is like unarmed. They're ex-convicts, and they're unarmed, and they patrol the streets, and they don't like, the idea is not to hassle anybody, but they do kind of do the move along thing.
Hmm.
And I happen to know that there are people in urban alchemy who are actively dealing drugs, and it's like, and which, like, surprise surprise, right? It's like corruption is going to happen. So it's like, this self-organizing thing, that, yeah, the mutual aid stuff that the left
Right.
gets a boner for. It's like, okay, that maybe that'll last 15 minutes of idealism until it
Right.
gets entrenched and institutionalized, and then you're going to have the same problems you have with any bureaucracy in terms of fraud and corruption.
Yep. No, yeah, I agree with you. Again, given the world we live in now, I'm on your side, at least for the moment, on this stuff. Um, so yes, this brings us to our friend Chesa Boudin,
Mhm.
who was elected district attorney in San Francisco. What was it, 2 years ago, 3 years ago?
That was 28, 19, that the election was. And then he took his seat in 2020, I think, if I'm not
So
getting it
about
wrong.
two plus 2 or 3 years. Okay. And he was recalled, and you were a big supporter of the recall.
Well, no, I didn't actually take a
No?
position on the recall. I actually, strangely, I did a video for Chase's campaign when he first got elected.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was pro Chesa during the original election, but I was I was hoping that he would get recalled, but I took no part in the actual recall campaign.
Okay. Well, that is a very big change of mind, and I want to ask you about that. So why were you supporting him originally?
Um, well, my politics have changed quite a bit over the past couple of years. Um,
Hmm.
so that's part of it.
Hmm.
And then
Hmm.
the other part of it is, I think he was a huge disappointment. So, you know, So part of it is that, I supported him because I, first of all, didn't think that hard about it, and I wasn't as knowledgeable at the time about sort of the nuances and the minute kind of mechanisms of the criminal justice system.
Mhm.
I hadn't given a lot of thought, and I didn't have a lot of understanding. So things like getting rid of cash bail just sounded like a good thing to me. I no longer think that getting rid of cash bail is a good thing. But these things just sounded good. I was in favor of, just in principle, moral principles like decarceration, all that stuff. And by the way, if he had carried it out in a way that if he had managed to both, um, control the crime rate,
Mhm.
and actually administer justice for
Mhm.
victims, and at the same time had carried out his sort of decarceral agenda, I
Mhm.
would have continued to support him. But
Okay.
he effectively and almost deliberately made a trade-off where he was like, I'm going to do this at the expense of the other thing. And I watched that happen, and it was kind of a revolting sight to behold. So I changed, but also I think that he was he was a failure.
Yeah. How did your politics change over the last 2 years?
Uh, well, some of it was COVID. Some of it was like, I think a lot of it was the hypocrisy of the left became too stark to ignore, and the PMCization of the left became too obvious to ignore. Um, a lot of the shit around vaccine mandates, mask
Mm.
mandates, the sanctimoniousness, the demonization and vilification of normal people, of middle America, so to speak,
Mhm.
just stank of elitism. Um,
Mhm.
the crew, the just like pathetic worship of the expert class.
Mhm.
All this stuff started to um, kind of remind or show me that the left is not the left that I came into when I was younger. It's the left has changed, and it's become something much different, which I no longer feel any affiliation to.
Mhm.
Um, so then that made me more skeptical about everything, about all types of leftist orthodoxies.
Mhm.
Um, so that was a big part of it. And then also some of it was just my reporting. Like, I started getting into reporting on crimes and stuff, and I started talking to people who are actually impacted by this stuff. I started to, like, for example, around the stuff in San Francisco. I'm talking to, I regularly talk to the parents of Tenderloin addicts.
Mhm.
Some of my consider friends, and there's quite a few like recovering addicts who I've interviewed and who I speak to on a regular basis, and none of them are supporting Chesa Boudin or his agenda. They like people who lived on the streets in the Tenderloin, and I interviewed people who still live on the streets in the Tenderloin who are like, who think that it's crazy, like who think that the San Francisco's policies are crazy. It's crazy what they're allowed to get away with. They're
Mhm.
like, it's crazy that I'm able to do what I'm able to do.
Right.
So like, I'm like, okay, this is just divorced from reality. So yeah, I think I just kind of came down to planet Earth.
One of the things the left did over the last 2 years was deny that there is an increase in crime.
Oh yeah, they're still doing it. There was a piece in Vice
Yeah.
today
Oh
making
yeah.
that. Yeah, literally, it says, in this piece in Vice, it's like, there has been no national increase in crime, nor even in the cities. That's like almost verbatim sentence from this piece in Vice today. It's
Uh,
bananas.
how often do you hear gunshots in your neighborhood?
Oh, all the time. I mean,
Almost.
I got rid of my Citizen app because it was just too disturbing because it's
Yeah.
connected to ShotSpotter, but I also hear it. Yeah, of
You
course.
actually, I hear them almost every night here. And I'm on the edge of East Oakland. It's not even that bad here. But it's every night, and I hear sideshows and drag racing almost every night too.
Oh yeah, 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 yeah.
You told me this another horror story before I forget about it. We were texting a few months ago, and you told me about something that happened in your neighborhood. Some guy walking up and down the street shooting into houses.
Yeah, that was I actually wrote about that on my Substack, which also was
Yeah.
published on Barry Weiss's Substack. We had a nanny for my 2-year-old, and she lives just like walking distance from my house.
Hmm.
And for anybody who's familiar with Oakland, it's on Fairfax Street, and she had to quit, and we had to scramble to find what ended up being my kid is in daycare now. We had to scramble to find an alternative because some guy had just walked up our street at like 9 o'clock in the evening, just shooting into random houses, and a bullet went through her living room. And she's from Mexico. You know, she's like a working class immigrant. She's not somebody who's like, you know, uh, she's not some bougie person who's like afraid of her own shadow. And she was like, but a bullet went through her living room. She was like, fuck this. They immediately started looking for to move out of Oakland. There was another story that I heard shortly after that about another neighbor who's just like on the same street, just a few blocks up, who had the couple that lived there came home from being out of the house, and they came home to a bunch of teenagers like carrying their property out of their house, like it broken into their house and they're carrying it out. So the husband chases them and pins down one of them, a girl, and the rest flee. But then he kind of pins her down, and then he like basically holds her in the house until the cops come. Right? He calls the cops, and of course the cops take. I think it was like 2.5 hours later. The cops still aren't there. By that time, the rest of that crew had come back to the house with guns and started shooting at the house and shot the guy in the shoulder. And then of course he and his wife sold the house and moved out of Oakland.
Yeah, so this kind of stuff, and we can speak to this, was not normal 10, 20, 30 years ago.
I mean, well, 30 years ago, like I mean the 90s, you remember Oakland, right? Like
Oh, well, during crack, yeah, during the crack
yeah,
era. Yes,
yeah,
yes, yes,
yeah.
yes,
It was
yes.
a worse then.
I was living in New York then, yeah, which yeah, okay.
Yeah. And by the way, you know, like I get accused all the time of like being a fear monger, like on
Mm,
Twitter and stuff,
mm.
naturally. But I do want to make it clear also, like I'm telling all these horror stories and they're all true and they're very terrifying. But you know, I feel fine walking around my neighborhood. It's not like I'm not like, you know, like I see the indices, but it's not like I don't think it's a war zone outside, even though there's a helicopter, which is probably a police helicopter right now, hovering over my house. But it's not like it doesn't feel like a war zone. Like I feel safe, but then you hear all these stories and you hear the gunshots and you hear the sideshows and you see the tent encampments.
I
San
mean,
Francisco actually feels more chaotic to me.
yeah, I mean, we are much more likely to have something bad happen to us though in Oakland. I mean, I'm
Right.
nervous about driving around at night now, and I didn't used to be.
Hmm. Hmm.
I mean, I think we should be nervous about it because it's so common now.
Yeah.
Crime. Yeah.
Well, Oakland, you're much more likely to be, much more likely than San Francisco to be a victim of violent crime. Well, that's not true. I was going to say that you're much more likely to be a victim of property crime in San Francisco and violent crime in Oakland, but actually, you know, being strong arm robbed is a violent crime.
Yes.
Being carjacked while you're in the car is a violent crime,
Yes.
and those happen in San Francisco all the time. So
All the
actually,
time.
that's not true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about Chesa Boudin. So he was part of this big wave of left-wing prosecutors who got elected a few years ago, sort of in the way, I guess it was George Floyd and all that, in various cities. Philadelphia is one of them. LA is another one. In fact, one of my former students is one of the major campaign managers for these people. But
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know if she
Mm.
regrets any of it now. But so talk about what Chesa Boudin actually did as
Becky
DA.
Bond?
What's that?
Becky Bond by any chance?
Jamara, her name now is Heiner. She got married.
Okay, okay, different
No,
person.
yeah,
Becky Bond
yeah.
is with Real Justice PAC with Sean King, which is
No,
what
Jamara was behind Gascon's campaign in LA.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Gascon, the predecessor to Boudin, who's like people in San Francisco consider to be like, you know, the moderate who Chesa Boudin replaced.
Right. Good Lord. So
Yeah.
what do these people actually do? I mean, talk about all of them. What do they actually do?
Well, I can speak about Boudin most closely, although you know you see analogs with Kim Fox and Alvin Bragg, and of course Larry
Hmm.
Krasner. on all these folks. Boudin, as soon as he got in, he got rid of cash bail. He started to, he pursued this decarceral agenda of kind of lessening charges for people who are guilty of sometimes some pretty heinous stuff. So,
Mm-hmm.
but certainly also of just regular drug dealing. Just started to plea people out for things like misdemeanor loitering and for people who are selling fentanyl in order to divert them into non-carceral paths.
Mm-hmm.
He he hobbled his own attorneys from being able to do things like collaborate with the police. There were little things which amounted to big things. Like my understanding is that there's an app that there used to be in place, probably is now that he's been replaced, that allowed police and the ADAs to all be able to track everybody who's on an ankle monitor, so that when they pop up, if they popped up at Civic Center BART station above ground and they're not supposed to be there and it's outside their perimeter, they would all get pinged. And I think Boudin did something like all the ADAs each had an individual login to that system before Gascon, and then he reduced it all under Gascon, and then he reduced it all to one login, which made it impossible for everybody to be able to log in. So he's literally preventing his own ADAs from being able to access systems which allow them to enforce the law. So he was doing many things like that. He was basically, he's a public defender who was elected to the DA's office. He was not unlike, he was the left-wing equivalent of when Republicans will appoint, Republican presidents will appoint the head of Chevron to the EPA, right? And they have their job is obvious, right? You know what they're there to do. That was what he was there to do, and he was, to his credit, he was plain about that when he wasn't dishonest about what he planned to do at the DA's office.
True.
So he did all types of stuff, but the overall effect was to basically eliminate the DA as a agency of law enforcement in the city of San Francisco under his tenure. It became an adjunct to the public defender's office.
I mean, he basically, in a sense, he radically reduced law enforcement.
Yes.
Right. Overall.
Yes.
Just reduced the enforcement of law.
Right. The DA's office is it's a part of a system, so he would constantly point to the police department and say, well, they're not making arrests, and if they bring arrests, then I can't bring charges, which is true. Technically, the police department did stop making arrests under Boudin, and I do think that there is legitimate criticism of them for doing that. But if you ask the police department, they would say, we're not bringing arrests because he's not bringing charges on these people. So what's the point, right? There, you have to understand the police is a human system where we're comprised of people who are in professions in which they're incentivized to. They're if a felony is bumped down to a misdemeanor, cops aren't going to make arrests on those charges because it makes no social impact if you arrest somebody for a misdemeanor. They're out the next day, and it brings no glory. It's not, there's nobody pats you on the back in the police department making misdemeanor arrests, although they do with a felony arrest. And there's human institutions where people respond to those things. So if both under Prop 47, which reduced all these felonies to misdemeanors, meant that police just weren't going to make arrests on those charges. And then also if the DA starts taking felony, converting felony arrests into misdemeanor charges, then the police are going to naturally stop making those arrests. Sure. That's what happens. And then also retailers aren't going to be calling the police because they know the police aren't going to make those arrests. So then everything stops, law stops working.
Right. Yep. Okay. I get it. I get the logical chain there. So what were the consequences of this? People have heard about shoplifting in San Francisco spiking. Is that true?
Oh, absolutely. You can go and watch it, which I have. You just go into these stores and you can just see it. I'm going to be writing about this. I haven't yet, but there was an incident at Whole Foods that I talked about earlier, where there was a security guard. There were people boosting, and a security guard who tried to stop somebody from boosting got thrown through plate glass. Like it's over by the cheese department. There was a big plate glass thing. He got thrown through it. Then another security guard came down to aid him, and he got choked out. So now Whole Foods and a lot of these other retailers. So the reason why you can just walk into a Target or a CVS or a Walgreens and just steal as much shit as you want to and walk out
Mhm.
is because the staff at those stores are explicitly instructed not to intervene. They
Oh.
used to collar your ass. Like if you're like not long ago, like 5-6 years ago, you like if you were stealing stuff, staff people would put hands on you, and
Hmm.
they'd bring you to the back and they would detain you under citizen's arrest until the police show up. And they had these loss prevention consultants. They don't hire the loss prevention people anymore because there's no point. They tell their staff not even to accuse somebody of shoplifting. You can't even go to the person and say, stop stealing, because that could escalate the situation. And if it escalates, then it could turn into violence, and then you have liability on your hands. You also have, in some cases, a political problem on your hands because you'll have a bunch of activists protesting. So it's not even, so they just let them steal the stuff. And then they just escort them, like they walk them through the aisles so that they know that they've got eyes on them. But the boosters understand and don't give a shit. They'll be like, you can't touch. They'll walk with the guys escorting them. They'll be like, don't put your hands on me. You know, you can't touch me. Don't touch me. While just lifting stuff off the shelves. And then eventually they'll just walk out the door, and then they'll be escorted out the door by the associates in the store. And then that's that. And then they go sell it.
And how do you know this is because of Boudin's policies?
Well, it's not all because of Boudin's policies. It's also because of Prop 47. So Prop 47 was passed in 2014, and that was the law which bumped down a bunch of felonies to misdemeanors, including like minor drug possession. But minor under the language of Prop 47 is not minor, and most people's, like, you can carry enough to be a drug dealer and still be considered minor possession,
Huh.
which meant that drug dealers weren't getting busted, which meant that, for example, the Richmond Police Department, Richmond is, for folks who are not from the Bay Area, Richmond is a very high crime area,
Yes.
city in the Bay Area. They don't even have a narcotics division anymore.
Oh, wow.
Because there's no point in busting drug dealers, because it's all just misdemeanor charges.
Wow.
But that was also the law that brought down the charge for shoplifting from $950. Like anything under $950 of shoplifting is a misdemeanor, not a felony.
Right.
So you go into a store, and in one trip you can steal up to $1,000 of merchandise,
Okay.
and it's going to be a misdemeanor.
Right.
So that was a huge part of it.
Okay.
And so that's why it's happening not just in San Francisco. You know, this boosting is happening in the East Bay too, and in LA and up and down the state. In fact, there's people who travel up and down the 5 boosting out of like there's the full-time job. They go from LA, they drive up the 5, they hit all these Central Valley gas stations and supermarkets and stuff in places where they're not used to this, and then they go and sell it in the Tenderloin to fences.
Oh my goodness. Did not. Yeah, it's become organized. We've seen this.
It's huge. It's hugely organized.
We've seen organized hits on department stores in the Bay Area, right? Where like a whole bunch of people.
Well, guys who come. Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So that's the smash and grab stuff. That's actually less organized than the regular day-to-day boosting. The smash and grab stuff is a little bit reckless. The regular, like the people who come into a CVS and steal like a shopping bag worth of merchandise and walk out, they're actually much more organized. So they're not stealing that stuff for personal consumption. And most of them are, I mean, there are people who do steal for personal consumption, but they're not stealing 12 deodorants for personal consumption. Those guys are stealing it to sell to fences. So they're also not generally stealing it to sell themselves, although that also does happen. They'll go to the Berkeley flea market and sell it themselves, but most of them are selling it to fences, and fences are people who deal in stolen merchandise. And so those people will, the way it works is that they'll have like private Instagram pages, or sometimes on Snapchat and other apps. Well, they'll put out word to all the boosters, and the boosters, the low level boosters, are just drug addicts. And they'll put out word, and they'll be like, we're in the market for this. Today we're looking for cough syrup with long expiration dates, and we want frozen steaks and makeup, or something, and they'll put out they'll put out the call to these boosters, and then the boosters will be like, oh, that's what's in. So they know where they're going. They'll walk in and they know which aisles they're going to. They have a shopping list in their mind of what they're
Wow.
stealing. They're going in there with like, they're not just stealing randomly off the shelves. They
Wow.
boost that stuff, and then they often hit the high end. Liquor is a big thing. Frozen shrimp is a big thing for some reason. They steal all that stuff, and then they bring it to UN Plaza, and they meet up with the fence, and they sell it to the fence. And then the fence usually sells it to a higher level fence. There's several layers of fence. So there's like wholesale fences who will then buy from those kind of retail fences. And then at the top level, there was like a bust a couple of years, number of years ago, maybe it was 4 or 5 years ago or something, where the police, there was a joint operation between like the local police and the California Highway Patrol, some other agencies, where they busted a warehouse in Concord with $20 million of stolen merchandise in it.
Oh,
And like there was like $80,000 of cash lying around.
whoa.
They sell, so the highest end fences sell like they sell internationally. Like a lot of the electronics go to, this is what I was told, the electronics go to Vietnam and China to
Hmm.
be sold on the black market there. Luxury products like a luxury, clothing and stuff get sold to Russia, to the Russian black markets. But most of it, but most of it gets sold on Amazon, Facebook Marketplace, eBay. Those are the main retailers for. So most of it is sold online. So Facebook Marketplace and Amazon, and to a certain extent eBay, are huge depots of stolen merchandise.
Oh
Um,
my.
yeah.
Huh.
So that's the black market in a nutshell, and it's a massive operation.
My goodness. Okay, so the
The
advent
drug
of
addicts are like sweatshop workers for this industry.
what's that?
Drug addicts are basically like sweatshop workers for this industry.
Oh, they're the ones who do the actual crime.
They go out and do the boosting. They
The
go
boosting, I
into
mean,
the
yeah.
stores.
Right,
They
right,
go
right.
out, they boost the stuff, they sell it to the fence, and they take the money and they go and
Gotcha.
buy the drugs from the dealer. Oftentimes, the fences will be standing right there. They'll direct them to the dealer. Like the police
Wow.
have observed this. The fences will be like, "Here's the money," and then they'll give them the money, and they'll go, your dealer's right over there," and then they go and they get their fix. And they do this multiple times a day.
My
Like the
goodness.
stores are like an ATM, basically.
Right. Okay, so the advent of organized shoplifting as an industry is one of the consequences of the decarceral campaign, right?
Right. Right.
Now, you've done some amazing work on what's happened to the drug trade in San Francisco. And it kind of confirmed one very important thing that I had suspected for a while about the involvement of Mexican cartels and other and Central American cartels
Yeah.
here. Talk about that, man. I
Right.
mean, this is a big deal, and it's happening in other cities too.
Yeah. It's specifically the Sinaloa cartel, which the Sinaloa cartel is not what some people think of as a cartel anymore. Because kind of, if you've watched Narcos, or like, if you have an idea of
Hmm.
like what the cartels were like back in the day, um, they're not as top down anymore. So now they're sort of like,
Yeah.
it's much more like a free market now. Like the
Hmm.
Sinaloa cartel is like the way it operates. This is from Sam Quinones's excellent reporting that I know this. So this is not my firsthand reporting, but like in Mexico, you'll have a bunch of meth labs and labs that create, and then fentanyl from ingredients that they source from China.
Hmm.
And but they don't work directly for the cartel boss. They're entrepreneurs. Anybody can set up a lab if you have the capital and the
Hmm.
know-how, and then start selling your product to mid-level dealers who sell it to smugglers. It's less of a top-down organization like it used to be, and now it's more of like a actual like Adam Smith style free market industry.
Right.
But collectively, it's kind of known as the cartel. And the Sinaloa cartel recruits Hondurans to, I don't know why it's Hondurans, but they recruit Hondurans to sell the drugs in the United States. So the way it works is that they'll smuggle Honduran nationals into the US. And by the way, these guys are scary people. They're like scary. They're like people who are scary in Honduras. And so they smuggle these people in, and they have a choice. This is how it's been explained to me. They have a choice of 5 cities to go to. It's like St. Louis, Seattle, San Francisco, a couple others. And they set them up. Salt Lake City is one of them. They set them up in one of these cities, and they sell and they sell and they sell until they get busted enough by the police that they start to, if they get observed and get kind of hot and become a known commodity to the police in other cities, unlike San Francisco, where they actually try to enforce drug laws, then they'll. I missed a step. When they get to the city, they have to pay back the cartel for transportation costs, but that's like
Right.
$10 to $15,000, which they can make in like a couple of weeks. Like it's like they make about $1,000 a day, at least in San Francisco. So it doesn't take long to pay back the cartel, a couple of weeks. And then once they work up enough of a rap sheet, then the cartel moves them to another city. Then there's some transportation costs associated with that they have to pay back. But they're entrepreneurs, like they're working for themselves. They don't work for the cartels. They pay the cartel for the transportation costs, the smuggling fees. They're supplied by the cartels, but they work for themselves. It's actually similar to the way, now that I think about it, that factory farming works with like chicken growers who don't actually work for Tyson. They're independent contractors, but they're supplied by Tyson. They sell to the Tyson processing plant, et cetera. So that's how it works. So these guys work for themselves. They're supplied by the cartel. They're transported by the cartel. They make about $1,000 a day, and they work shifts. They come in the BART train in the morning. They come in, they clock in. There's no clock, but they start their shift. They work 8-hour or 12-hour shift, and they come back at the end of their shift, and they all stay actually not far from us on International Boulevard. And they've been seen by both cops and by just regular passengers on the BART train, like splitting up bindles and splitting up cash just on the BART train at the end of their shifts or the beginning of their shifts. It's a job. So that's how it works. It's a very easy trade to disrupt if we enforce laws.
And
this
these
is
are
all
scary.
done the open.
And these Honduras is the murder capital of the world. Last I checked, right? Has the highest murder rate, I think. And that's where these guys come
yeah,
from.
I believe. Yeah. Scary place.
Okay. And because of Boudin, I guess, they are, as you said, they are no longer enforcing drug laws on the street. So there's open air drug markets in downtown and San Francisco, but especially in downtown San Francisco. And now the thing is, Leighton, here we come to the controversial part of this of this conversation. You think that it seems to me that you think that is maybe the heart of the problem, is that they're not enforcing drug laws in particular, right? You see that as especially deleterious. Is that right?
I would say that the number one thing that I would expect of law enforcement in San Francisco is to bust the drug dealers. Yeah.
And why is that?
Because because the drugs are so widely and readily available in San Francisco that what it does a couple of things. The drugs are incredibly cheap because of that, and because the laws are so lax, people come to San Francisco to be addicts. Why wouldn't you? You can sleep on the street. You can get general assistance money from the city to buy drugs with. You'll get 3 meals a day, and you won't get hassled. And it's incredibly easy to get drugs, and the drugs are cheap as hell. So because the drugs are cheap, it draws in addicts, which increases the homelessness problem, and then it creates this whole industry of petty crime in order to fund the drug habit. And that doesn't just include shoplifting from major retailers who people on the left have no sympathy for, even though they should, because there are people who work at those stores who face I describe people getting violently attacked, but also when these stores close, people lose their jobs. And also when a Walgreens store closes, people like senior citizens on fixed incomes aren't able to get their prescriptions easily, and they have to take the bus across town. And there's all types of knock-on effects for this stuff. But also, people like all the catalytic converter jackings and the carjackings going through people's cars and just stealing the crap in their glove compartments. home invasions as well. Like a
Yeah.
lot of that stuff is driven by the open air drug market in the
Yep.
Tenderloin as well.
Yep.
So all of this stuff, it emanates from, three or 400 guys selling drugs in the Tenderloin who we just let do it.
Okay, can you go through this again? You mentioned this, but I want to really do this carefully. Can you catalog all the ways in which the government of San Francisco encourages or aids people in doing drugs, in being homeless and all that? I mean, what are the
Yeah.
you mentioned a couple things, but I want to go through it. Like, let's what do you get from the city government of San Francisco if you want to go there and be a drug addict on the street?
There was an addict who told us that he gets about $600 a month for free. We have it on video. I think he gets SSI and then general assistance from the city.
Okay.
And we interview the interview is amazing. We're like, because this is one of those guys who's like, I can't believe that they let me do this.
Right.
And he's like, this is Michael Schellenberger interviewed him, and he's like, so what does it take to get this general assistance money? He's like, a fucking phone call, bro, a fucking phone call. And he's like, I got net. He's like, I don't want to pay. He's like, why are you living in tent? He's like, because I don't want to pay rent. He's like, I got to tell. I got Netflix and Amazon Prime on my phone. He's like, why the fuck wouldn't I do this? Why the fuck would I pay rent? Um, he goes, he's like, the cops, yeah, they used to give us a hard time. Now they're like your neighbor. That's what he said about the SPD. So all these activists are like, oh, the cops are brutalizing the homeless. And then you talk to the homeless, and they're like the cops are like practically our friends. They're
Yeah.
like the cops are like, he's like, one guy, a different guy who we interviewed is like, who I was there for that interview too. He's like, yeah, man, I got some homeless friends who complain about the cops, and I'm like, dude, anywhere else in the country, you would be in jail for 15 minutes for doing the type of shit that we do.
Yeah.
So there's impunity. You're allowed
Yeah.
to, Chesa Boudin made a pledge not to enforce public camping laws anymore.
Yeah.
So you can
Right.
camp wherever you want to. That's going to change under
Yeah.
Jenkins, but I haven't seen
Good.
much of a difference yet. Um, the city will, you can get cash from the city. Of course, you can get 3 hot meals a day from all the charities in the Tenderloin. No problem with that,
Okay.
which means that the rest of the you can spend on drugs. The city will provide you with needle exchange. They'll provide you with laundry services, showers. They will provide you with clean foils. I don't even understand the purpose of clean foil. Like, I get needle exchange, but like, why do they give you clean foil to smoke fentanyl out of and meth out of? I don't get that. So they'll provide you all that. They'll provide you with a safe consumption site. So
Mm-hmm.
it's Tenderloin Linkage Center. They have a site where you can just go and use unmolested, and have SF Department of Public Health personnel on hand to give you Narcan if you overdose.
Okay.
The activists want to see the city hand out the drugs themselves to people. It's called safe supply, is the phrase for it, where in which the city would actually give you your meth
Right.
or your fentanyl or whatever.
Right.
And they would be able to make sure it's safe, uncut or whatever.
Right.
And so then we're passing this Rubicon where the city is actually giving people drugs. That's what they want. San Francisco is not doing that, at least not now. But that's the aspiration. So the all this stuff is, and there's very very little. There's like, it's considered, like, a lot of these activists considered inhumane to put the least bit of pressure, including just moral pressure, upon
Mm-hmm.
people to check into detox and recovery. So
Mm-hmm.
while they will say, like, those services should be available to people who choose to go into detox and rehab,
Mm-hmm.
it is kind of considered verboten to, perhaps it's not considered verboten to suggest it, but to put any kind of pressure on anybody, including moral pressure, is considered stigmatizing. So, the big picture is that it's like, basically, if you want to come and be a homeless addict in San Francisco, the red carpet is rolled out for you.
Okay. Well, okay. So the thing is, it sounds to me like not enforcing drug laws is the least of it. That the reason that San Francisco has 10,000 or 5,000 or whatever it is people on the streets doing drugs and selling drugs is that the city is subsidizing them and doing that. And I mean, that seems like an easy sell politically, or easier, is to say, why don't we just stop government assistance of drug taking and drug dealing and homelessness, right? Just stop that, and but let people take drugs if they want to.
Well, I mean, the problem with that is that if you cut off the assistance, then that just means more boosting, right? That or more car breaking in
Oh,
cars, whatever, right? Like it's like they got to get their money
oh,
somehow. They're either getting it from the city or they're getting it from like from petty crime. So like I don't, but like to me, it seems crazy that one would think that an easier political sell is to do that, is to do something which is arguably inhumane versus like busting drug dealers. Like, I mean, are we really at the point where it's considered like inhumane to bust somebody who's selling fentanyl and meth to kids on the street? Like, it's like that's considered, and yes, it is, because I've had this argument with people who are like, who I had an argument the other day with somebody who was telling me that he thinks it's in, like, he was like, well, what would you do with these drug dealers? And I was like, I would arrest them and deport them. And he's like, well, deportation seems like a really like inhumane, radical measure. And I'm like, dude, I've reported on immigration. I've always been very pro immigration, including
yeah.
undocumented immigration for people
Mm-hmm.
who are coming here to work in a kitchen,
Mm-hmm.
to do like honest work. I don't want to deport those people, and I'm in favor of sanctuary laws for those people. But if I went to Mexico City and started selling fucking meth to people, like put my ass in prison to serve
Mm-hmm.
a sentence and then deport my ass. Like there's no nation on earth that would consider it inhumane to deport somebody who's selling like fentanyl and meth to their own citizens. That's insane. Like you don't do that. That's evil. So
um hmm. Well, okay, so you said at first kids, selling to kids. So I mean, there's broad agreement that no one should sell drugs to kids. But what about selling drugs to adults?
I mean, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm laughing because I'm picturing a drug dealer like carding people for like, for
Yeah,
like
yeah.
selling them drugs. Um, but no, I think it's like, I mean,
Like,
selling meth to adults. I
yeah, like to me,
selling.
like I did meth. I did meth when I was in like 22, 23 years old. I was
It was a
fine.
different meth back then. It's much worse now.
But why should people be stopped from selling me meth?
Uh, well, because I mean, for all the reasons because it fuels this awful industry of like you're supporting the Sinaloa cartel, and then you have to create. I mean, if you're asking about drug legalization, right?
Yes, 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 yes. And I know your position on this. I'm just trying to like uh
Right.
open it up here. Yeah.
So OxyContin was a legal drug, right? Like
Yep.
OxyContin started the opioid epidemic. Like this argument about legalizing drugs makes zero sense to me, because
Huh.
you know I've had this argument before where I'm like, so are you saying that we should be, so anybody should be able to just sell meth on the street? And then they go, no, 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 no. If it's legalized, then it's got to be regulated somehow. Like of course we're going to have regulations, right? Because nobody's going to argue that you can sell whatever you want to like on the street, like poison that will kill people. Like that's a
Mhm.
crazy position, right? We both agree that you can't sell like like a tiny amount of fentanyl can kill you, right? So
Mhm.
like we both, I would think, would agree that you should not be, any people shouldn't be allowed to sell just fentanyl of whatever dosage they want to consenting adults on the street that's going
I
to kill
mean,
them.
should people be allowed to sell strychnine?
No.
Oh, okay.
You mean as rat poison, or what are you talking about?
Well, whatever. I mean, just poison. Just should people be allowed to sell poison?
Uh, well, if there's somebody selling poison like strychnine on the street to people who are, and there's a market for that, like, would
Yeah.
these people be trying to kill themselves, or are you suggesting that people would get high off of strychnine? I'm trying to understand the context.
Well, I mean, there's lots of dangerous things that are sold to adults all the time that are allowed, and why,
Well,
like very dangerous things. So why drugs?
because people don't consume strychnine and then die like they do with drugs. Like we know about drugs that they're addictive, and that if you sell them, people will fall into addiction and have no choice but to buy more of your shit that will eventually kill them. If there was an epidemic of people buying strychnine and dying, then I would say, yeah, we should probably outlaw people selling strychnine on the street, but it's not a problem.
Okay, but right, but it's not an automatic. You don't automatically die from taking meth. It's not like, right, or
No,
fentanyl even.
no, well, fentanyl, you don't automatically die, but there's no such thing as a long-term fentanyl addict. You'll die
Uh,
within 3 to 5 years. Eventually, you'll overdose.
okay. Um,
Uh, but so to get back to Oxy,
yeah.
you had a product which was legal, but had, severe, or had very, serious regulations around it, like any prescription drug. You had to go to a doctor, you had to
Right.
get a written prescription. You could only get so much at a time. You'd have to
Mm-hmm.
get your prescription renewed like any other drug.
Mm-hmm.
And because it was so highly addictive, a black market was created where people were selling their scripts for it, and then started to create counterfeit Oxy, or selling heroin as an alternative to OxyContin, and then eventually fentanyl. And so it created the black market. So why would that not happen with, like, if you like the legal market for OxyContin created the black market for Oxy and then for fentanyl.
No, the regulation created the black market
How so?
because you can't get certain. The reason people go to the black market is because they can't get certain drugs because of certain regulations,
So then if you
right?
remove the regulations, then you're just going straight to it wouldn't be a black market anymore. It would be an
Right.
above ground market.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
so your suggestion would be that we remove all regulations and then have, like, Pfizer or whoever, I don't know who, well, I'm sorry, of course I know who produces OxyContin, Purdue Pharma would be able to produce as much um, unregulated OxyContin as they want to, at as high a dose as they want to, sell it to anybody to be able to sell it to anybody else, and that would be a functional system.
Well, how could that be worse than what we have now under regulation? We have a black market that's killing people all the time and creating cartels and criminals all
Well,
the
first of all,
time,
because you would have a huge corporation selling, like, with billions of dollars of investment behind it to be able to mass produce and mass distribute it.
right?
First of all, so we could get into cannabis with this, because this is what's happening with cannabis, which I'm critical of. So first of all, it becomes an industrial product.
Yeah.
But second of all, it's like you're the reason why OxyContin was created in the first place was because you had this substance that, like, you had, because opioids were being used as medicine, and so then you had, like, the R&D behind creating more and more high potent painkillers.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that should have been regulated in the first place. Like, I mean, we're all critical of the FDA giving OxyContin a pass as being like a FDA approved drug, because Purdue somehow managed to convince the public and the FDA that chronic pain should be treated through opioids, which never
Mm-hmm.
should have been allowed in the first place, right? That should have been more regulated, not less regulated. You shouldn't have been allowing chronic pain to be a thing that's treated with opioids. It didn't
Um,
used to be.
hmm. So, okay, I mean, I'm thinking right now about what's the rum you can buy that's 180 proof, 180 proof rum, I guess it's called. I mean, that's what that happened, and same with beer. I mean, now you can get like beer that has like 12% alcohol in it, which is way more than what beer used to have.
Right.
Um, I mean, should that be stopped legally? Should that be banned legally?
No, but
Oh,
I would suggest that alcohol isn't really the like great sort of counter argument that people think it is, considering
no.
how many people die off alcohol. Like the same people try to make this case that alcohol, like, to get to cannabis, the same people try to make the case that alcohol is so much worse than cannabis, and at the
Mm-hmm.
same time make this case that, like, well, if prohibition, like, are you advocating we go back to prohibition? And it's like, well, which argument are you making? Are you making the argument that alcohol is really bad, or are you making the argument that alcohol is benign? Because alcohol is a problematic substance, right? It's like it increase, like, when during prohibition, and I'm not in favor of prohibition. I drink plenty, but during prohibition, health outcomes were like extraordinarily better than during non-prohibition times. Domestic violence went down. Like there were all types of good outcomes to prohibition when people stopped drinking alcohol. There were also bad things like a black market that emerged, and
Like,
organized crime and all that stuff.
yeah,
So
right.
like it's a mixed bag, but like let's judge these things for the complicated sort of real world realities that they are, rather than the ideas that we have in our mind, like alcohol being a legal substance. No, I don't want to change that, but it has plenty of counts against it, right? There's like, it's not like that's an industry that we should emulate and
Yeah,
say let's make all types of other substances legal, just like
right.
alcohol, because alcohol's working out so well.
Right. But you're for, so you're not for prohibition of alcohol, but you are for prohibition of drugs, right?
If by pro, well, what do you mean by prohibition?
Outlawing it, making it illegal,
I think that
keeping it illegal.
keeping it illegal, yes.
Yeah.
I think that drugs should be, I think that the drugs that are illegal should more or less stay illegal. I don't think that they should be criminalized. Like, I am in favor of decriminalization of drugs. I think
Okay.
we should decriminalize cannabis, but not legalized it.
Okay. So again, I guess I need to know, like, why is alcohol different?
Uh, because alcohol is, well, it's just the status quo. Like, alcohol is what it is. It's part of our like, I wouldn't make the choice if I was like creating a Sim City or something,
Mhm.
and was trying to create the most positive outcomes for a society, and I could create it from scratch. Then I don't know, I'd have to think about whether I would be in favor of alcohol being legal, like from the get-go. But that's not
Mhm.
the situation we're in, right? Alcohol is I'm not going to change. I'm not in favor of creating a new rule to make alcohol, which is part of our daily lives and our reality, is something that I enjoy. It's a big part of our economy. It's a big part of our lifestyles, illegal. But that doesn't mean that I'm in favor of taking every other substance that gets you high and brings you euphoria and legalizing it. Like, that's the radical position. Like, what I'm arguing about is not the radical position. What somebody who's
Right.
saying legalize drugs is arguing, that's the
Yeah.
radical position. The burden of
Sure.
proof is on the person who's favoring changing all these laws more than it
Right.
is on me.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, but are you not saying that alcohol should not be criminalized because it's simply traditional? It's part of our, it's part of our culture. Unlike meth and fentanyl, those are new, I guess. Is that why they shouldn't be they should be prohibited, but alcohol shouldn't?
Well, I would first of all make the case that meth is worse than alcohol.
Okay.
It has a higher incidence of making you psychotic, for example. There are very few. There are alcoholics who end up homeless. There's plenty of alcoholics who end up homeless. They usually end up doing harder drugs after that. But there are people who've lost their homes because they've lost their lives to alcohol, right?
Yeah.
So that happens. But there are many more people. If you're going to start drinking versus starting meth, the chances that you're going to end up homeless
Yeah.
and hopelessly addicted are a lot higher if from smoking meth versus
Um,
drink, right?
okay. So I'm not an expert, but I do know about other experts. Are you familiar with the work of Carl Hart and Gabor Mate?
No,
Okay.
tell me.
Um, they have argued, as I understand it, they have argued that with quite a bit of research, a lot of data. Carl Hart's he's a professor at Columbia. I forget which department, one of the science departments. Anyway, that these drugs that you're talking about are far less addictive than we are led to believe, and far less harmful. And so, um, yeah, I mean, there's just countless people who have taken, like me, who have taken these drugs, have taken meth, have taken heroin, cocaine, even many times,
Mhm.
even, over a few years have taken it sort of almost in an addictive way, who are no longer take them and are just fine. I mean, I'm sure lots of people who used cocaine, heroin, or meth at some point in their lives
Sure.
and did not get addicted and did not end up on the street. So
Okay, so a
I,
couple of things. First of all, heroin nowadays, when I
yeah,
meet a homeless addict who's on heroin, literally, like, my first thought is like, oh, you're one of the responsible ones if you're still doing heroin, because
Right.
heroin is hard to get now. It's like 5% of the drug supply in San Francisco right now is heroin. It is, you have to pursue heroin to get it
Huh.
because it's been drip, because everybody who's doing heroin has switched to fentanyl,
Right.
because it's so much more powerful. So if you're, so heroin, in the greater scheme of things, like when we were kids, heroin was considered the most nightmare drug there was, right?
Right.
Even worse
Yeah.
than
Yeah.
crack.
Sure.
Um, Heroin is like on the modest end of the hard drugs now. Like the shit is way worse now. The
Hmm.
meth that you did back in the day was made out of ephedrine. It is no longer made out of ephedrine. And this
Hmm.
is, by the way, I will grant that this is a good argument in your favor for the legalization thing, because when we made ephedrine illegal and we put export controls and import controls on ephedrine, export controls out of Mexico and import controls out of here on ephedrine, this Mexican chemist came up with a new way to make meth, which is called
Yeah.
the P2P method. This is again Sam Quinones is reporting, which created a way more potent, way more fucked up meth. Meth used to be a
Yeah.
party drug. You'd like be in a conversant mood, hang out all night.
Yeah.
Now you're like in a corner by yourself doing it. It's much darker and it makes you psychotic.
Hmm.
So the meth is way worse now. So like first of all,
Hmm.
like it is somewhat comparing apples to oranges if you're talking about somebody who was using these hard drugs, 20 years ago versus now. The drugs are just way worse. But second of all, I would say that, I mean, the just walk through the tenderloin and just like, sure, there may be a lot of people, and Carl Hart, or these scholars may be able to point to a lot of people who have done a ton of drugs and been fine. And yes, you're right. I do know a lot of people who've done a ton of drugs and then become outstanding citizens. I also know I know several people who were friends of mine who've died of drug overdoses. I have another friend who ended up in a homeless encampment and was murdered. There are like, yeah, you have to have a predilection to have like an addictive personality to end up in the most hopeless case. But there's a lot of people with that predilection, and
Hmm.
if these hard drugs are more available, if they're easier to get. I mean, for example, like right now we're dealing with people who are like, a lot of these drugs are sold on Snapchat,
Hmm.
and now fentanyl is in everything, right? So
Yeah.
from back when you were recreationally using, say,
Hmm.
I don't know when you were using, but like if you're a kid, you're like a teenager, and you
Yeah.
were like just a dumb fuck teenager, and you're like just trying to party and fuck around and experiment. Nowadays, if you were today, you might order your drugs on Snapchat, and what you would get, and you might order a Xanax, and what you might
Hmm.
get back is fentanyl that's
Right.
counterfeited to look like Xanax. And then you take fentanyl and you get you might overdose off that one pill of fentanyl, or you might get lucky and not overdose and then become addicted.
Okay.
So it's like it's the ubiquity, the cheapness, and the potency of the drugs today is far more dangerous than it used to be. And so yeah, even if most people don't become addicted, the folks who do are creating tenderloins in American cities all across the country.
Right. But isn't regulation what caused the use of fentanyl? Because people can't get the Xanax, and so they're desperate and for something else, for a replacement, and therefore the criminals who inhabit the black market created by the regulation say they find a cheaper way to provide that. That
I think thinking in those abstract terms
Hmm.
is really reductive. Like as I granted to you, putting those regulations on ephedrine ended up having the downstream consequences of creating a stronger meth. So
Right.
you could extrapolate from that regulations cause the black market. I
Yeah.
think that's a pretty academic argument. Like, I mean, I'm a reporter. What I like to do is to look into the actual, what actually happened in the real world. And in some cases, yes, regulations can create that consequence. That doesn't
Hmm.
mean that regulations automatically create that consequence. But like the idea of like removing all regulations on drugs and not interdicting drugs, not arresting drug dealers, just letting it be a free for all. Like, I mean,
Hmm.
what I'll just ask you, what do you
Hmm.
picture? Like, if you picture removing all regulations, all law enforcement, and just allowing like anything goes, are you picturing a society in which drugs become like less available, or drugs become like fewer people are using drugs, fewer people are becoming addicted? Like what do you think comes out of
Yes.
that environment?
Yes.
Oh,
Portugal.
wow.
Portugal is what
No,
we get. So I know what you have to say about
No.
Portugal, and I get it. What do you mean? No, I mean,
You smoke meth on the street on Portugal in Lisbon, you get arrested.
sure, but they're decriminalized though. Drugs are
Yeah, they're
decriminalized there.
decriminalized here too. But if
Uh,
you use meth, if you Portugal in Portugal, they have a system that works. I totally support the Portugal model, but it is not what they're doing in
okay.
San Francisco.
No, I get you. I know. There's a difference. I know that, and I want to talk about it. It's very interesting the difference. Um, I mean, yeah. So the cartels will no longer exist. Am I right? If we legalize drugs in the way that I'm talking about.
I don't see why the cartels wouldn't. I mean, I suppose they'd be replaced by American corporations.
Well, that's a big difference, isn't it?
Yeah, it's
I
probably
mean,
worse.
you think what? Come on now.
They
Wait,
have a
what?
lot more money.
Wait. I mean, no
Do, do,
one's
do
no.
you think that American corporations are going to be like, as a matter of conscience, make their drugs less potent or like
They're
less
they're not gonna
addictive?
they're not gonna be murdering tens of thousands of people.
No, no, that's true. Okay, if you're talking about the violence in Mexico around that,
and
then that's
here and here I mean
but
the streets of Chicago, that's what's going on in Chicago, is that, and St. Louis and Baltimore, is the cartels have moved in and are shooting up their competition there.
I haven't reported on those cities, so
Okay.
I'll take your word for it. It's definitely not what's happening in terms of like violent crime in Oakland. That is not like that's not which I have reported on. That is
Sure.
not driven by the drug trade.
Right.
Um, but I was just referring to like addiction and chemical dependency. If you
Yeah.
hand it over to corporations, it's like American corporations to create highly addictive drugs, then what you're going to get is even more addictive drugs that are even more scientifically managed to keep you enslaved. Like there's just more money behind it. There's just going to be more I think we both agree that it's not as if like American corporations are going to have like more of a moral constraint around
Oh
creating more
no.
drugs, right?
Oh no, totally
They
amoral.
have a lot more firepower than the Sinaloa cartel around being able to create
Well,
like highly addictive drugs, right? They just have
firepower.
more money. Well, they have more money,
Do they? I mean, the cartels are not
money, more
broke.
expertise. No, they're not broke, but they're also not like fucking like Anheuser Busch or like you
Yeah.
know Philip Morris.
Okay.
These are like huge corporations getting behind creating drugs. I don't see how that mitigates the drug trade
Okay.
in this like crazy world we're entertaining.
Well, it mitigates the bad effects of creating a black market. Again, the gangsters have no reason to enter this market if it's now a white market, and they have no reason to
So
create
then you
fentanyl.
have an American population that's chemically enslaved by multinational corporations.
Okay, so you use the term enslaved twice now, and um, so you believe, I know you believe that that drug addicts, am I right? Are enslaved, have no free will. There's no choice involved. They are
The most
enslaved.
addicted, yes.
Yeah.
The most highly addicted, yeah, like the people walking through the Tenderloin who are, if you walk through the Tenderloin, the people who are like have been driven into meth-induced psychosis, and who are, just degrading themselves beyond belief in order to get a fix, do not
Mhm.
have an agency.
Okay. What, and I think this might be true for, there's a lot, it's not just drug addiction, although there's a lot of that, certainly, but among the homeless, there's also a lot of schizophrenia, is there not?
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah.
And the reason the schizophrenics are on the streets now, of course, is the what's it called, deinstitutionalization that took place in the 1980s, right, where they no
And
longer no
yeah.
longer, and this gets to the nub of the argument here, right? There was no longer, it was no longer allowed, courts were no longer allowed to sentence people to mental hospitals, to incarcerate people in mental hospitals, right?
Right.
And now one of the consequences of that, which, this is a really hard question, by the way, I am still working this out myself, but one of the consequences is that the schizophrenics in our society no longer are in mental hospitals, but they're on the streets of San Francisco,
Right.
right? They have nowhere else to go, and they cannot function because they're schizophrenics. And hard to argue that they are not in some way enslaved to their mental illness, right? So
Right.
I'm with you there, but I do want to, I just want to explore this with you before we get back into drugs, because this is maybe the most vexing political issue I've ever thought about or had to deal with, and I don't have an answer. I don't know what to do, because on the one hand, I believe that it might be the worst thing that governments have ever done to human beings was to sentence people to mental hospitals. Because we
Mhm.
know, I mean, one flew over the cuckoo's nest is just one example of people who are just weird or wacky or have strange ideas or have dissident politics, or who have some maybe mental illness, but they shouldn't be in a prison for the rest of their lives, right? There's that, and so
I mean, it was
deinstitution,
even worse what we were doing to them before that.
which is
People
what?
were people would chain up their relatives in the basement who
Oh
had
yeah,
schizophrenia.
yeah, right,
It wasn't the
right. It's
government doing it, but it was like,
this is
you know,
hard. It's
yeah,
really, really hard. So on the one hand, I have very powerful feelings about that, very powerful feelings about the government determining who is crazy and who should go to prison because they're crazy, right? That seems to me clearly very problematic. But at the same time, I also have very powerful feelings about schizophrenic people in the thousands being on the streets
right.
for all kinds of reasons, for their good, for my good, for your good, for the good of society. It's a horrific thing. So I don't know. I've had some ideas about this, but I don't. What is the? And now you think, and I'm not with you on this, but you think that in addition to the schizophrenics, drug addicts of a certain type also don't have any agency and free will and are enslaved to their condition. So, and they're on the streets too. This is also true. Like, what is the solution? And you
I
you
mean,
do,
first of all, these are not two discrete categories, right? There's so much overlap between
yeah,
these because there's people with untreated mental illness who end up on the streets, and then when they're on the streets, they end up doing drugs, right?
yeah,
And then there's people who are highly addicted who end up doing so much meth that they become schizophrenic.
right,
Like if you have you have to have a genetic predisposition to being schizophrenic, I believe, in order to become like
yeah,
permanently schizophrenic from meth use. But if you do have that predilection, then there is a very good, like, meth will drive you into
yes,
schizophrenia. And if you don't have that predilection, you'll still become psychotic while you're on meth. It's just that you won't become permanently schizophrenic so that you're still psychotic when you're off meth. So like
right,
the overlap between those two categories is it's very hard to parse out
sure,
one from the other. In either case, like the most hardcore drug addicts, this is my opinion from having, talked to many like folks who've recovered from this, relatives of those folks, and of people who are addicted today, and just seeing them every day. It is hard for me to um, attribute uh, the like any sort of significant agency to those people such that I would be like, one day they're going to come to their senses and voluntarily check themselves into detox and rehab, that they're going to hit some sort of like floor and be like,
hmm,
enough, I need a change in my life.
right.
They're gonna overdose and they're gonna die, and they're gonna live miserable existences until that happens.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably true. But what do you want to do about it? I mean,
uh
you want to deport the drug dealers or arrest them and put them in prison. That's
yeah.
clear. But what do you want to do with the users?
So first of all, with the dealers, I actually, the more important thing is I want to incapacitate them. So even if, like, it doesn't have to be a imprisonment and deportation, although I think they deserve it.
Mm,
But if you want to put ankle monitors on them and and be able to monitor them so that they can have relative freedom but not be free to sell drugs in the Tenderloin, fine.
right.
But just get them off the streets, make it impossible for them to sell drugs. With the users, I mean, I think that first of all, if you're not violating any laws, using illegal drugs is violating the law, and that is a crime. But I don't, again, I believe in decriminalization, so I do not believe that somebody should be jailed for just using illegal drugs. But I do believe that we should enforce basic laws against things like shoplifting and selling stolen merchandise and breaking
Hmm,
into cars and home invasions and things like that.
hmm,
So it is almost inevitable that if you are, unless you have some sort of like trust fund or some other source of income, if you are on the streets and addicted to drugs, you're eventually going to be resorting to those crimes. And I do believe that we should enforce laws against those crimes. And if you are addicted and you are violating those laws, then I think you should go through a court system. But I think there should be an alternative to incarceration. I think that you should be essentially coerced into treatment, and the criminal justice system is the means that we have to be able to coerce that treatment. And I've interviewed many people who have had that exact experience, where they're hopelessly addicted to drugs. They broke the law, they were arrested, they were either kicked in prison, which is incredibly agonizing, or they were more fortunate and they were given an alternative to be diverted into drug court, where they could be put on some sort of like methadone assistance or even heroin assisted treatment, and were able to taper off of drugs and be put into rehab. And I have never interviewed anybody who said, you know what, that was totally not worth it. I wish I could go back to being a drug addict. Like every single one of them says, thank God that happened to me, because I'd be dead, or I'd still be out on the streets, and I don't want that for myself.
Right.
So like, I think that's what should happen.
So government coercion into drug programs.
Or people who violate crimes.
Yeah. Yeah. And is that what goes on in Portugal? I think it might be. Is that right? Is that what the Portuguese do?
Yeah,
Okay.
more or less. In Portugal, they have, I'm not an expert on Portugal, but but if they do not allow open drug dealing, and they don't allow open drug use. You will be arrested for open drug use, but they have a robust infrastructure for treatment and recovery. So this we do not have here. So like, I cannot snap my fingers and put in place the system that I'm imagining. There would have to be a massive bureaucracy built out so that we have detox and rehab beds and like multi-year recovery centers for every single one of these people. For a lot of these folks, it's going to take years to recover, because first of all, you need to detox. Then you need to, first of all, get over your addiction, which can take 6 months. It can take longer than that. But like, if you've been living on the streets for years at a time, like for example, there's an organization I'm familiar with in Oakland that does takes in homeless youth and does like job training and stuff for them. And they told me like they have these youth come in from 9 to 5 no matter what, because they need to acculturate them to even the structure of having a 9 to 5 workday. Because when they go to, if you're sleeping in a tent, you don't know what time you're going to sleep. It could be 10 o'clock at night. It could be 2 o'clock in the morning. You have no conception, because you don't have to wake up at any given time. So like even the very idea of like a 24-hour clock and being like vaguely aware of what time of day or night it is, you have to kind of acculturate people into that, let alone like a work ethic. So like, you need to have like the rehab goes beyond just the drug use. So this needs to be a multi-year thing for folks. We don't have the infrastructure for that like they do in a lot of European countries. So that stuff needs to be built out, and that's a massive undertaking. So it's not just about changing the laws. It's also about building these recovery institutions, which you do not have.
Yeah. I am much more sympathetic to that. Yes. And so you're looking more to Europe as a model than to Asia as a model for how to deal with drugs, right?
I'm all about the Duterte model. I think we should just execute.
Totally.
Execute.
Let's go.
No, I think what I think the solution that I have, that I advocate for, which is Michael Shullenberger's solution, by the way. It's like, I want to give him credit for it.
Okay.
Calcite is way more humane than all the like people who hate on me from the left, who call me a fascist. What they advocate, which is to have people continue to sleep in tents on the sidewalk, addicted to meth and fentanyl and shit, and die an early death, and have their families go through continued emotional agony the whole way through, and have kids who grow up and who are put into foster homes and who will probably become drug addicts themselves, like all the knock-on effects. That's their solution, is the status quo in San Francisco. I think that's disgusting.
Yeah. Well, the status quo, I certainly don't want that. I guess, okay. Well, if you want to, it sounds like you're basically broadly in favor of the Portuguese model.
Yes.
Okay. In that case, then we don't have a major beef. I would want to modify it a bit, and maybe the philosophy underlying it could use some modification. I mean, I as I said, I don't quite agree with you on drugs and about agency and will and stuff, but if that's the actual model you're calling for, I could get behind it.
Yeah, I even agree with like heroin assisted treatment. Like there's like, there's things that can be considered radical, which I'm fully on board with, and I'm in favor of safe consumption sites if they are pegged to a process that is pushing people towards recovery. Like if you need to be like you need to taper off, right? So like if you have sites that are set up for people to be able to use drugs with people on hand to give them Narcan in case they overdose,
Yeah.
but that system is part of a process that's pushing them towards abstinence-based recovery, I'm fine with that. But what we have right now in San Francisco and in other cities, Vancouver and Seattle and places like that, is just the supervised drug sites with no pushing. So it's just, you're just going to have somebody to Narcan you so that you stay alive, but you stay addicted to drugs until eventually you don't have somebody around you Narcanning you, you overdose and die.
Yeah. No, I'm with you on that. I'm still haunted by the question of what to do with the schizophrenics. And there's quite a bit of overlap. You're right, but there are also people who are just straight up schizophrenics, and someone's got to make a decision, right, about whether we're going to do anything about that as a government, or or how does the government determine who is crazy, right? That's where the problem is. I don't know if you have thoughts about that.
I mean, look, I fear, as we started off this conversation talking about my sort of disgust with the PMC and this worship of the expert class,
Yeah, right, right.
and the during COVID, so I share the same anxieties about like, handing over this kind of social and political power to like psychologists and doctors, and the whole sort of one flew over the cuckoo's nest horror show. I don't. But my aspiration isn't for like some sort of perfect system, which is flawless. Like, yeah, I think that schizophrenic people, I think the humane thing to do, both for them and for the fabric of society, is to put them into institutions, and those institutions could, and like there's many ways that those institutions could look, and ideally they are humane, but they could be like one flew over the cuckoo's nest, in which case we would need to eventually dismantle those institutions. But it's like, whatever the solution is not going to be perfect. It just needs to be better than what we have, right? And what we have is, it's hard to imagine something worse than what we have, something worse than the Tenderloin.
It's beyond horrible. I mean, there's no doubt about it. By the way, I lived for 3 years 2 blocks from Skid Row in LA, which is like next level. People don't realize this. It's about a mile square, I think, of it's a zombie zone. I mean, you can't even believe it. It's worse than San Francisco, believe it or not. It's worse, much worse than San Francisco. It is.
Well, the thing that's worse about it is worse in one sense. I mean, we by the way, when Michael and I went down there the last time we went down there, we interviewed a guy who literally built a 2-story structure on a corner of the sidewalk, and he's got a bedroom. He's the second floor is for him to what do you call it, to like arrange dates, which is, he's a pimp, right? He's just like whoring out addicts on the, so like, and this is happening. And I interviewed a cop after that, and he's like, oh yeah, that guy, I forget his name, but he was like, oh yeah, that guy, he knows him. He's like, oh yeah, he was asking us about how to install solar panels. So like, it is worse in one sense, but in another sense, it's like the Tenderloin is in the middle of downtown San Francisco. It's like, that's a difference. Skid Row is easily avoidable, and so, which is better and worse, but it's like, picture that, taking Skid Row and plopping it, like picture taking Skid Row and plopping it in Silver Lake,
it is downtown.
It is, but there's nothing. It's the fashion district and the flower district. It's all wholesalers, warehouses. You don't go to Skid Row if you're not either working at one of those places or, a dealer or an addict.
You almost literally cannot drive through Skid Row in LA because people will lurch in front of your car.
Oh yeah. It's fucking Walking Dead.
Yeah. So okay, well, so you want to give the government back that power, though, to put people in mental institutions?
If they no, the way I would phrase it is, if somebody violates the law, then we should enforce our laws, and they should either face criminal consequences, which is traditionally putting them in jail, or they should be have the choice to avoid incarceration by being diverted into a much more productive system, which would be rehabilitation based. I mean, all I'm calling for is rehabilitation. This is like what the left has always, like, at least when when I was younger, the left was calling for rehabilitate for our carceral system to be more rehabilitation based
Yeah, yeah,
before they became abolitionists, right? And that's
right.
what I'm calling for: rehabilitation for people who are not criminal psychotics, right? They're not psychopath criminals. They are people who have untreated mental illness and addiction issues, and they should be put into treatment. And that should be the alternative to incarceration. Right now, they get either put into jail or prison,
Yeah,
or they're just released onto the streets, or more accurately, they just cycle through both of those things.
yeah. You're
I'm
part
just
of the
calling
old.
for them to be put into treatment.
Yeah, I mean, which is the old progressive model. I mean, progressives are the ones who invented the the mental institution model. But you
Right.
want obviously you want to reform that as well. You don't want to go back to the cuckoo's nest.
No, no, of
Right,
course not.
right,
But
right, right,
like
right.
it's like, it's like that's used as this excuse where like because there were abuses of the system at one time, that means that it's like we should
Sure.
rule it out entirely and never try it again. And it's like, like I don't know, we there's been many institutions that have been fucked up in the past that we haven't just given up on, right? Like
Okay.
I mean, I suppose that's sort of the this is why like the left has become very nihilistic, where it's like because the police are imperfect, we should abolish the police. Because prisons are imperfect, we should abolish prisons with like no,
Sure.
like a lot of the left doesn't even feel like an obligation to be able to describe what will replace it. It's just this like article of faith that if we abolish these institutions, something better will just automatically emerge, and that's just not the way the world works.
Agreed. 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 Back to this homeless thing though. So I mean, a lot of people, the only law they're breaking is the no camping, no loitering laws, right? So is that what? So I mean, being acting crazy is not illegal, but what
No.
happens is a lot of people act crazy while they're squatting in a tent on the street. So, and I'm just fleshing this out with you. I'm not arguing, but I mean it. So that in that case, you would favor incarcerating those people in mental institutions if they're violating that law, the no camping law.
No, I wouldn't. No, because I don't think that camping on the street is a significant enough offense
Okay.
to warrant like imprisonment, essentially. Because the rehabilitative model I'm calling for, is still imprisonment because you're not
Yes.
free to exit the system.
Right.
I do believe that we should not allow public camping. Like I
Me
don't
too.
think it's okay.
Me too.
But it's a move along thing, right? It's like sorry, it's last call. It's like you don't have to quit drinking, but you can't do it here, right? You just move
Yeah.
along. You're getting pushed out of the bar. You can continue to use drugs. You just can't use it. You can't just do it in this fucking park, right? You can't
Right.
do it on the
Right.
sidewalk. You can't
Right.
camp on a sidewalk. Um,
Right.
so it's up to you to figure out what you're going to do with yourself. Like it is not up to, it's not the responsibility, and it shouldn't be the power of the government to figure out what your alternative is. You're an autonomous human being.
Yeah.
You figure it out. Like you have a friend's place to crash on or whatever. You want to move out to the wilderness and like sleep there, do it. But it's up to you to figure that out. But you cannot pitch a tent on the sidewalk and sleep there. But no, I don't believe that you should be incarcerated for pitching a tent on a street.
Okay. But drug addicts should not be treated as autonomous individuals
What do you mean?
because you want to force them into treatment programs.
Well, if they violate the law, I mean, like if they commit a crime, I should say, not violate the law, because yes, public camping is a violation of the law. But if they commit a
Okay.
significant crime, if they are boosting from stores, which is a misdemeanor, but they're doing it repeatedly, they get arrested for the 12th time, stealing from stores. You should have, there should be a criminal penalty, but that is an opportunity to steer you into rehabilitation. It's an intervention. Like this is, it's just like in an intervention with the family. It's a social intervention. So like I, to your premise that there are a bunch of people who are camping on the streets and doing drugs openly, and that's their only violation of the law. I question that. I'm not saying that you're necessarily mistaken about that, but where's the money coming from? Where's the money coming from that they're spending on drugs? It's got to be coming from somewhere. And unless they have parents sending them money, or like, relatives sending their money, they're not employed. So they're probably getting it by some sort of illegal activity. It's
Yeah.
kind of inevitable that you're eventually going to be doing crimes.
Yeah, no, I was getting at your argument about drug addicts not having agency, free will, which means that they're and then arguing that the state should not treat them as autonomous because they have no free will, because they are enslaved to the drugs. And I'm wondering why you're not applying that to schizophrenics.
Well, I would apply it to schizophrenic. You mean like a schizophrenic who's not using drugs, who's on the street,
Yeah, yeah,
which is probably not very common, but I would apply it to schizophrenics if they've done
okay,
a crime, if they've committed crimes.
okay,
I'm not saying people should go to into involuntary rehab for the moral crime of doing drugs. I'm saying that if you commit a crime, you should have an alternative to incarceration, which is rehabilitative.
okay,
That's all I'm saying.
okay, cool. I will join you in building the Portuguese
Just to
model.
give
And
you an idea about the what I'm talking about lack of agency, I've interviewed a paramedic in San Francisco. I'm sorry, an EMT in San Diego, a firefighter, who was talking about how they will. So when they come across somebody who's like passed out on the sidewalk and perhaps about who's overdosed and is probably going to die. They administer them Narcan, right? So the first thing they do is they come up to them. So the first thing they do is if they have a backpack or something, they separate the backpack physically from the person because there's probably a weapon in the backpack. Because if you're on the street homeless, you have to have weapons.
yeah,
And the moment that they wake up from, if you administer naloxone to somebody, the moment that they wake up, what it does is it just basically immediately wipes all the opioids from your opioid receptors.
mm,
You wake up immediately in withdrawal. And withdrawal, the feeling of withdrawal is that you're going to die. So they administer the Narcan. These people wake up pissed off. They're not like, oh, thank you for saving my life. They're like, fuck you for administering Narcan. You've blown my high. And now they're immediately in need to get drugs again. So they're not getting on a gurney. Oftentimes, what the EMTs will do is they'll administer just enough Narcan to
mm,
keep them unconscious and still high, so that they can get them on a gurney and drop them off at the ER, and then it's the ER's problem. If they give them enough Narcan to actually wake them up, then they immediately need to get a fix. So then they have an iPad. The EMTs have an iPad to sign a against medical advice thing.
mm,
So they sign that thing. They say "fuck you" to the EMTs. Then they say, "Okay, sign this thing." They sign the thing, and then they bolt. And immediately their next task is to get high again because they're in withdrawal. They're dope sick, which means that they have to get money, which means that they have to commit a crime. So they have to go and boost some shit and then sell
yeah,
it to a fence to buy drugs from the drug dealer or some other crime in order to deal with their sickness. So
right.
that's what I mean. Like you've just been your life was just saved, but you're not thinking that way. You're thinking my high was blown and I'm sick again and I need to get well. That is
Hmm.
not human agency. That is you are living as an animal.
You don't think there's any choice in there?
No, because I mean, the choice to not go to an ER, like that they're choosing to,
Yeah.
they're so sick that they need to, it is so lizard brained. Like you're so sick that it takes over every other consideration in your life. Your only thought is to not be sick again.
Well, but how many people were in that state and no longer are? I mean, I was a very serious alcoholic for about 20 years, and it was inconceivable for me to stop drinking for that whole
Mhm.
time. And then one day I stopped and I haven't had a drink in 10 years. And that's I'm
Well,
one of many people. And that's true for meth users, that's true for heroin users, that's true for crackheads, everybody, right? I mean,
I've interviewed a lot of like people in recovery, um, and I'm not like I'm sure that there are some people out there who just woke up one day and decided to check themselves in detox or rehab,
mhm,
but there's well, I would say every single recovering addict I've spoken to has had some moment of intervention, and it was usually an arrest. It was usually the criminal justice system. But sometimes it was something else that was extremely dire, like they were going to lose their kid or something like that. Usually it's arrest. So it is very rare that somebody just decides, who's like smoking meth for 3 years and then just decides voluntarily to get clean.
and yeah, I know that. Well, I know that happens. I don't know the numbers on that, but I think there's a significant number of people who have on their own kicked an addiction. I mean, enough to to suggest that they had some choice and some agency.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess we'll have to leave that
Yeah.
unresolved. But my experience from talking to folks, I have not heard that story very often, ever actually,
Okay.
about not having some sort of thing that compelled them into detox. And this might also be a new thing because the drugs are so much worse now. They're
Yeah.
much more addictive. They're much more potent. That the success stories that you used to hear in the past about hitting rock bottom and like having an epiphany, the cliche now is that rock bottom is death now.
Yeah. 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 Well, on that uplifting note, I want to thank you for doing all of the work that you've done. And as I said at the beginning, I mean, it's really challenged me and made me rethink all of these things that I have held on to as almost articles of faith for a long, long time. And it's great to
That's
go
like the
through this with you.
highest form of flattery. You're saying that, so I
It
appreciate that.
is. It is.
Yeah.
It is. Absolutely. I mean, that issue, drugs. I mean, just last night on my live stream on Unreported, I was just railing about how we need to legalize drugs and that's going to solve everything, which I still believe. Not everything, but the big things.
Mhm.
Anyway, Leighton, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for your work, and keep going, man.
Yeah, thank you.
All
Take
right.
care, man.
All right, thanks. This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To become a patron of the show and have access to bonus episodes, AMAs, and the Unreported News Analysis Show, go to patreon.com/unregistered. Thanks for listening.